קדמה, על אנשים ואירועים להיסטוריה היהודית.
The Hidden History of Purim. Hello and welcome to Kedma. I am Noam Eshkoli. This is not a regular episode of Kedma. This is an experience, an experiment in honor of Purim. I upload the text of chapter 28 about the Book of Esther to Google AI engine, and it creates a podcast in English from it. Both the translation and the adaptation to dialogue between two hosts, and even the creation of the voice themselves. For me, it was amazing and also a bit disturbing. The content itself is mostly faithful to the original Hebrew source. So feel free to share with English speaker. Enjoy.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
Now today, you've brought us a story that I think a lot of folks are going to be familiar with, at least on the surface. It's the Book of Esther.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, classic, right?
Yeah.
But instead of just sticking to the familiar narrative, your curiosity actually has us doing something I think really interesting. It's like we're going to be digging into a potential, hidden history here.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and along the way, we're going to see what this story might reveal about Jewish identity in Persia way back when.
Right, yeah.
So I'm excited for this. It's going to be a mission, but our mission together is to unpack all the layers of this book, considering historical context, of course, and the different ways that it's been understood over the centuries.
Absolutely, I think that's key.
Yeah.
But I got to be upfront with you from the start here.
Oh, okay.
The period around the Book of Esther, it's kind of like considered a black hole by historians. Surviving records, especially from the Persian side, well, they're pretty limited.
Right. I mean, that makes sense. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. And while we do have the Hebrew Bible, we got to remember it wasn't written as some kind of comprehensive historical account.
Right. It's not like a textbook.
Exactly. But honestly, despite that challenge, I think it actually makes things even more intriguing.
Oh, I like that. So it's like we're detectives almost.
Kind of, yeah. It's this journey where we try to piece together the potential historical realities, and then we see how they might inform your understanding of Purim, which is ultimately what the Book of Esther is all about, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. So as we kind of embark on this exploration, you've got us asking some really key questions.
Good.
So first off, who was this King Ahasuerus? Is he the Persian king Xerxes' past, also known as Koshiarsh?
Yeah, great question.
We're going to be looking at some interesting linguistic clues and trying to align historical timelines, and hopefully we can figure out if this connection actually holds water.
I love it. And then building on that, you've rightly pointed out the sheer scale of Xerxes' reign.
Yeah, he was a big deal.
Yeah, he had these huge military ambitions, most notably, as you've mentioned, that massive war against Greece. And I think it's super striking, as you've observed, that these major historical events, really major, are completely absent from the Book of Esther.
Yeah, it's almost weird when you think about it.
Right. So we really got to dig into why that absence might be so significant. I think it's key to understanding the whole thing.
Absolutely. I'm with you on that. And then we're going to turn our attention to another fascinating aspect, Jewish identity in Persia.
Okay, yeah.
The fact that both Mordecai and Esther have Persian names raises all sorts of questions.
Yes,
right?
It does.
We'll explore the broader context of Jewish life in exile centuries after those initial deportations to Babylon to kind of get a sense of what their names might be telling us.
And to really broaden your perspective even further, we should touch upon an alternative interpretation.
Okay, I like this. Lay it on me.
There's this midrashic view that actually presents Mordecai and Haman as generals in the Persian army.
Whoa, that's a whole different take.
It is. It gives you a completely different lens to view their relationship and everything that unfolds in the story.
Okay, so we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah.
But finally, I think it's important to grapple with, the fundamental purpose of the Book of Esther in the first place.
Sure, yeah.
Is it purely meant to be a historical record, or could it be employing satire, or maybe some deeper messaging that we might miss if we just take it at face value?
Right, exactly. Yeah. We got to get beyond the surface.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack all this.
Let's do it.
And I think a great place to start is that big question you raised. Who was this Ahasuerus?
All right. Well, when historians are trying to pin down the timeline of these Persian kings, they often turn to figures like Herodotus.
Oh, yeah.
a Greek writer from the 5th century BCE, roughly contemporary with Ezra the scribe. He was a pretty interesting guy. He traveled extensively, documented everything he saw,
A real historian.
Yeah. Now, of course, we have to approach his accounts with a healthy dose of skepticism, given, the whole context of the Greek-Persian conflict at the time.
Right. There's definitely some bias there.
For sure.
Yeah.
But he still offers valuable insights into the period.
Yeah. And it's interesting how his attempts to write down Persian words and names often resulted in some, creative spellings.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Like the Persian title Kshafir Pavan, which basically means a regional governor, right?
Right.
He turned it into satrap.
Yeah, that's classic Herodotus.
It's like, okay, close enough.
Close enough.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this might connect to like the longest word in the Hebrew Bible, Hash-Ashtarpin, which also refers to these district rulers.
Oh, yeah, that's a mouthful.
It is. But these linguistic quirks highlight how Persian names were adapted into Hebrew. And that actually makes the identification of Ahasuerus a bit more plausible.
Exactly. And, when we look at the lineup of Persian kings, Cyrus the Great is like this pivotal figure. He's known for allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Judea and rebuild the temple, right?
Right.
His dynasty, they're called the Achaemenid dynasty.
Achaemenids, okay.
Following his successors, Cambyses and Darius, we get to Darius's son, Kashiarsh,
Okay.
who reigned from roughly 486 to 465 BCE.
Okay.
And this is where, the debate really heats up.
I bet.
Could this Kashiarsh be the Ahasuerus of the Book of Esther?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is, and there's actually a pretty compelling linguistic argument to be made.
Okay, tell me more.
So in Hebrew, there's this tendency to add an aleph sound to Persian words, starting with a K sound.
Okay.
So Kashiarsh could quite easily become Akasharsh and then Ahasuerus.
Oh, I see.
And we even see a shortened form, Aksharesh, at the very end of the Book of Esther.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is. Now, there are some historians, as you might imagine, who propose other identifications. Some say, maybe it was Artaxerxes II. And they've got their reasons, but I think the prevailing scholarly view does lean towards identifying Ahasuerus with Xerxes or Kashiarsh. And this connection, I think, is further strengthened by some other pieces of evidence that have come to light.
Like what?
Well, like the El Yehudu tablets. Have you heard of these?
I don't think so.
So they're these clay fragments that were discovered in Babylon, and they contain legal documents with, get this, Hebrew names.
Wow.
And one of these tablets, it's dated to the 9th year of an Ahasuerus. Like that's the very name the Jewish community in Babylon used for him at the time.
Wow. That's a pretty strong connection.
It is. So we've got these linguistic similarities, and we have these contemporary Jewish records using the name Ahasuerus in a way that seems to really align with the timeline of Xerxes.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about this historical figure, Kashiarsh. What else do we know about him?
Well, his dad was Darius, right? And his mom was actually Cyrus the Great's daughter.
Yeah.
So he's got a pretty strong claim to the throne.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
His wife was known as Amestris, which, it does bear a slight resemblance to the name Vashti, but,
Maybe. Yeah, it's a stretch.
Yeah. And there are inscriptions from Persia itself, really grand stuff. They refer to him as the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing many kinds of men, king in this great earth far and wide. That's quite the title.
That's a mouthful, yeah.
Yeah.
It really gives you a sense of how he saw himself.
He's a big deal.
He was, yeah.
Yeah.
But the Book of Esther, it primarily depicts him as this king who's kind of preoccupied with feasts and beauty contests.
Right. Like living the good life.
Yeah, very Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
But historical sources, particularly Herodotus, paint a slightly different picture of his early reign. He faced a pretty serious revolt in Egypt, which he suppressed very forcefully, unlike his predecessors.
Really? So he's not just about the parties.
No, not at all. He also took action against the Babylonian religion. He even destroyed the temple of Marduk in Babylon. That's the very place where they found the Cyrus cylinder, if you remember.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, significant. And that, in turn, led to even more rebellions in Babylonia.
So he wasn't exactly Mr. Popularity.
Not really, no. But then, of course, there's the big one.
Yeah, the war with Greece.
Exactly. This massive military campaign against Greece. It was huge. Years in the planning, probably starting around his 3rd year as king. Herodotus gives us these really staggering numbers for the size of his army and navy. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. And even if those figures are exaggerated, which they probably are, it was undoubtedly a colossal force. It was this coalition of warriors from something like 46 different nations.
Wow. And were there Jewish soldiers in there too?
That's a great question. And the answer is, yeah, most likely. There were probably Jewish soldiers, probably mercenaries.
Makes sense.
This wasn't a new thing.
Right.
We have evidence of Jewish military service in foreign armies, going way back. There's this inscription found at Nimrod's fortress in the Golan Heights. It mentions this large chariot unit from the kingdom of Israel joining the Assyrian king Sargon after the destruction of Israel.
Wow, so this goes way back.
It does. And I think you'll find this next example particularly interesting. It's about this Jewish military community on the island of Elephantine in Egypt.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
So they discover these papyri there, right? And they reveal this thriving community of Jewish soldiers.
Mm.
They have Hebrew names. They're serving in the Persian army that occupied Egypt.
Wow.
They even had their own temple, and they exchanged letters on religious matters. These guys were responsible for the southern border of Egypt.
So it's like a whole Jewish community within the Persian army.
It is. It really highlights this little-known aspect of Jewish life in exile.
Yeah, you don't usually hear about that.
Not really, no. And this practice of Jewish individuals serving in foreign armies, it actually continued later on with Alexander the Great and even the Seleucid kings.
Wow.
But going back to Xerxes' war against Greece, one of the most famous battles, of course, is Thermopylae.
Ah, yes, the 300 Spartans.
Exactly, that heroic stand. The Persians ultimately won there, but it cost them a lot. However, in the naval battles that followed, like Salamis and other engagements, the Greeks actually emerged victorious.
So it wasn't a clear-cut victory for Xerxes.
Not at all. His grand campaign, in the end, it ended in defeat.
Wow. And after this major setback, Xerxes went back to Persia, to his capital in Susa. And Greek sources from the time depict him as turning to a more, shall we say, pleasure-seeking lifestyle.
Oh, so back to the banquets.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, these Greek historians, they weren't exactly unbiased, right?
They had their own agenda.
But it does start to paint a picture. We have a king who embarks on like the largest military campaign in history up to that point. Preparations seemingly start in his third year, this massive multinational army.
Right.
It's a war that resulted in devastating losses. And by his sixth year, he's back in Susa. This was a monumental event, something that everyone at the time would have known about.
Absolutely. A turning point in history.
So here's where it gets really interesting. What do we find about all of this in the Book of Esther?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much nothing.
Right.
Instead, the narrative focuses on these lavish banquets, descriptions of clothing and food, all this palace intrigue, decrees going back and forth.
A very different focus.
It is. And this huge discrepancy has led a lot of historians to conclude that either Ahasuerus is not Xerxes or that the entire story is not meant to be taken as a literal historical account.
Okay, so it's like, is this legend? Is this historical fiction? What are we dealing with here?
Exactly. It's almost like the author is deliberately omitting these huge historical events to prioritize a different kind of narrative, like maybe focusing on these seemingly mundane details to poke fun at the whole idea of worldly power.
Ooh, that's an interesting take. I like that.
Yeah, it's a bit provocative. Now, just to be clear, this is a deep dive into the sources, not a theological discussion.
Right, right.
So we're not here to give you like a definitive religious interpretation of the Scroll of Esther.
Of course, of course.
But I did come across this fascinating perspective from Rabbi Yaakov Madan that I think gives a compelling way to understand all of this. He suggests that the author of the scroll was clearly very familiar with Persian culture and governance, like they knew the ins and outs.
Yeah, they were in the know.
Totally. And of course, the Persian language itself. In fact, Dr. Tamar Ilam Gindin has even argued that the author's command of Persian might have been even better than their Hebrew.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So what's fascinating here is this idea that the author was probably assuming that their audience was generally aware of all the historical events, including Xerxes' wars.
Right, it was like a common knowledge back then.
But they deliberately chose to omit those big narratives and instead focus on these like trivial details, the feasts, the attire, the food.
It's a very specific choice.
It is.
Yeah.
So what does all of this mean? Well, the suggestion is that the Book of Esther is using this sharp, witty kind of Jewish satire, almost like a form of cynicism.
Ooh, interesting. I can see that.
Yeah. The scroll has a specific purpose, and it's not just to be a history book. Xerxes, who, boasted about ruling the world, is deliberately portrayed in this, ridiculous and embarrassing light.
Right, he's kind of a caricature.
Yeah. And without explicitly mentioning God, the narrative subtly hints at who the true ruler of the world actually is.
I like that. It's like reading between the lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, remember those events we talked about in the 3rd year of Ahasuerus' reign?
Yeah.
That would have been when all the preparations for the Greek campaign were in full swing, right?
Right.
What does the scroll say happened?
Let's see. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The army of Persia and Media and the princes and governors of the provinces were present before him. For a long time he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty 180 days.
180 days. That's 6 months.
A very long party.
Who parties for 6 months straight? I can barely manage 180 minutes.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
But the point is, this wasn't just one big continuous party.
Right.
It probably represents this period of extensive preparations
Oh, I see.
involving the military, officials from all across this vast empire. Maybe the evenings were used for like networking, building alliances, kind of like the social events you might have at a modern professional conference.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then after this half year of intense planning, boom, they throw a week-long feast for all the residents of Susa.
Wow. It was like a big finale.
Yeah. So why the complete silence on the military preparations themselves? Well, the theory is that the scroll is intentionally written not from the perspective of a state or military chronicler, but almost from the viewpoint of like a fashion or gossip columnist.
Oh, that's a fun way to think about it.
Yeah, it is. It's like, imagine how the Oscars are covered. You've got some reports that focus on the films themselves, but so many more just dive into the fashion on the red carpet.
Oh, absolutely. That's what people want to know about.
Exactly. Or think about election night coverage before the polls close.
Okay, yeah.
What do the commentators talk about?
I can't believe I'm actually interested in this.
They'll talk about like what time the polling stations opened, what the candidates were wearing when they voted, who they voted with.
Right, those little details.
It's like these seemingly insignificant details become the focus. And the Book of Esther, according to this interpretation, is deliberately using this approach to highlight the absurdity of Ahasuerus' self-perception as, the ruler of the world.
I love that. It's like turning the lens on power itself.
Yeah, it's a bit subversive. You see another example of the satire in that dramatic scene with Queen Vashti.
Oh, yeah, the infamous Vashti.
Yeah. So Memucan, the senior minister, one of the 7 advisors who govern the empire, right?
Yeah.
He addresses the king and all the other officials, and he's expressing outrage, not just at Vashti's disobedience to the king, but at the potential widespread impact on all the men in the empire.
Yeah, like it's the end of the world.
I know. He warns that Vashti's actions will embolden all women to disrespect their husbands, leading to disdain and anger. It's almost comical in its overblown concern.
Yeah, like a slippery slope argument taken to the extreme.
It's like Ahasuerus believes he rules the world, but he can't even get his own wife to listen to him.
Oh, the irony.
Yeah, it's great. And this exaggerated reaction really underscores that satirical tone. It's something to appreciate as you read the story.
Absolutely. So keep that in mind, folks.
Now, we talked about the events of the 3rd year.
Yes.
When does the story of Esther actually begin in the scroll? When does Ahasuerus start looking for a new queen?
Good question. Let's see. Later, when King Ahasuerus' fury had abated, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Okay, so that's when he starts thinking about a replacement. But wait, there's a pretty significant time gap there.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Esther is actually taken to the king in the 10th month, which is Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign.
So that's like a 4-year gap.
It is. And what happened between the 3rd and 7th years? Xerxes' massive and ultimately unsuccessful war against Greece.
Right, that whole debacle.
Exactly. So he comes back defeated, and his focus shifts from world domination to basically a reality show to find a new wife.
It's like a bad season finale.
It is. And the really significant historical events in between, they're deliberately glossed over.
It's like they never happened.
Almost.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Persian context, but of course another crucial aspect of the Scroll of Esther is the Jewish presence in Persia.
Right, we can't forget about them.
These are ostensibly the heroes of the story, right? Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther.
A protagonist.
Yeah. Now, I gotta admit, my childhood image of Mordecai is probably like a wise rabbi with a long white beard.
Yeah, I think that's a common image.
But that might not be entirely accurate.
It might not be. Now, those familiar with rabbinic midrashim might share that image. But it's important to remember there are other contrasting midrashic interpretations as well.
Right. There's always more than one perspective.
Always. So to approach this with an open mind, let's consider their names. Mordecai. It's derived from the name of the Babylonian god Marduk.
A god.
Yeah, a major deity. His father had a beautiful Hebrew name, Jair, yet he gives his son this Babylonian, seemingly idolatrous name.
That's fascinating.
It was actually pretty common at the time.
Really?
Yeah, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, archaeological findings, they're full of examples like this.
Okay, so it wasn't necessarily seen as like a betrayal of Jewish identity.
Right. It suggests a degree of integration into Persian society. But it does raise questions about the nature and the strength of their Jewish identity in exile.
Right. It's a complex issue.
It is. And then there's Esther.
Right. Esther.
Her name comes from the Persian goddess of beauty, Ishtar.
Another god.
Yeah. Known in Canaan as Ashtoreth. That's actually the root of the English word star.
Oh, wow.
So again, a seemingly non-Jewish name.
Right. But she also had a Hebrew name, Hadassah.
Right. So we have these Jewish individuals with names of pagan deities. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. Now, if we accept that Ahasuerus is Xerxes, the events of the Book of Esther take place roughly 120 years after the exile of Jehoiachin and about 100 years after the destruction of the First Temple.
Okay. That's a long time.
It is. And what happens to a community after 120 years in exile?
No.
Especially when there's this desire to integrate into the surrounding society.
That's a big question. What do you think?
Well, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Imagine the large wave of immigration from Eastern Europe, say, about 120 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
Where did most of them go? To America.
Right.
A much smaller percentage came to what's now Israel.
Yeah, that's true.
And within a relatively short time, many adopted American names, American identities. Intermarriage rates increased.
Yeah. Assimilation happened pretty quickly.
It did. So, how many of their descendants today still maintain a strong Jewish identity?
That's a good question.
It is. It's something to think about. And you can see the same patterns in Germany about 200 years ago. And the argument here is that the Scroll of Esther is telling a similar story.
Oh, interesting.
It's the story of immigrants in a new land. The first generation, they struggle with a new language. They focus on their children's education. They remember the old homeland with nostalgia.
They're trying to hold on to their roots.
They are. But the second generation, they might feel embarrassed by their parents' foreign accents. They want to fit in, so they try to fully assimilate into the local culture.
Right. Sometimes they even try to erase their past.
Exactly. And the third generation, they feel more at home. They see the old country as this distant, almost archaeological relic.
Right. It's like a museum exhibit.
Yeah. And the fourth generation, they might have little to no connection to their origins.
It's like the thread gets thinner and thinner.
It does. And that's what we might be seeing with the Jews of Susa in the Book of Esther.
So they're like fifth generation immigrants at this point.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So how strong would their Jewish identity have been?
It's hard to say.
And we've got to remember, this is after Cyrus's declaration allowing Jews to return to Judea and after the rebuilding of the Second Temple had begun.
Right. So they had the option to go back.
They did. But many chose to stay in exile.
It's like they had put down roots.
Exactly. Now, the prophet Ezekiel, decades earlier during the Babylonian exile, he already addressed this tendency towards assimilation.
What did he say?
What is in your mind shall never happen, the thought. Let us be like the nations, like the families of the countries.
Wow. So this was a concern even back then?
It was. And it wasn't just the pagan names. It was the integration into Persian society. I mean, Mordecai sits at the king's gate. He's closely associated with the palace, and nobody seems to bat an eye.
That's interesting.
Yeah. This wasn't the role of just a guard. The king's gate was a place of judgment. It suggests he held an official position within the government.
So he was part of the system.
He was. He had learned the system, and he had advanced within it.
And did they know he was Jewish?
Maybe, but Haman, at least initially, didn't. The scroll states, but he scorned the thought of laying hands on Mordecai alone when Haman was told who Mordecai's people were.
He had to be told.
Yeah, it wasn't obvious.
And what about Esther? Did they know she was Jewish?
The text explicitly says no. Mordecai tells her not to reveal her background.
Wow.
Ibn Ezra, the medieval Spanish rabbi, suggests that Mordecai told her this because he was afraid it would hurt her chances of becoming queen. They both wanted her to win this royal beauty contest.
That's a pretty pragmatic approach.
It is. Now, while traditional commentaries have their own important roles, This approach tries to understand the plain meaning of the text within its historical context.
Right. It's a different perspective.
It is. And beyond this more literal reading, there's also this fascinating midrashic interpretation that offers yet another layer of understanding.
Okay. Tell me about this.
I first heard about this from Rabbi Benny Lau. It's hinted at in the printed editions of Tractate Megillah, but it appears more fully in Talmudic manuscripts.
Oh, so like a hidden gem.
It is. It was actually omitted from the printed versions for some reason. We don't really know why. But it does remain in the Jerusalem Targum to Esther and in Yalkut Shimoni.
Okay. So it's out there if you know where to look.
Exactly. And this midrash tells us something pretty surprising. It says that Haman and Mordecai were actually generals in the army of Ahasuerus.
Generals. Wow.
Yeah, probably during the war against Greece.
So they were on the same side.
They were. Both sons of immigrants, both trying to make their way in the world. And the military was a common path for advancement.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
Exactly. Now, listen to the language of the midrash. I think you'll find it really interesting. It says, once the king gave money and sent them at the head of troops to conquer a certain province, Haman took his money and spent it all, and nothing remained for him. When he needed to pay the soldiers, he had nothing. But Mordecai had half of his money left. Haman came to Mordecai and said to him, lend me the money you have. Mordecai said to him, I will not lend to you unless you sell yourself to be my slave.
Wow. So Haman was in debt to Mordecai?
He was. Basically, General Haman mismanages his troops and supplies during the war. He runs out of money.
Classic Haman.
He goes to General Mordecai for an emergency loan, and Mordecai agrees to help, but on one condition. Haman has to acknowledge Mordecai's higher rank.
It's like a power play.
It is. Now, the war ends in failure. They come back to Susa, and they enter politics. They become ministers. Interestingly, Haman rises in prominence.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman.
Yeah, he's doing well for himself. But every time he sees Mordecai, Mordecai reminds him of what happened during the war, who was in charge, who owed whom. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor.
So it's like a constant thorn in his side.
Exactly. And this is something Haman just cannot accept. He needs to eliminate this reminder of his humiliation, but he doesn't want it to look like personal revenge.
So he comes up with this elaborate plan to get rid of all the Jews.
Exactly. There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction.
It's a chilling moment.
It is, and it really sets the stage for the central conflict of the scroll.
Yeah. And then we reach that pivotal moment. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes.
He's in mourning.
Yeah. He sheds those garments of a court official. And these events, they trigger a return to his Jewish identity.
It's like a wake-up call.
It is. And he tells Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace will escape any more than all the other Jews.
So even she's not safe.
No one is safe. It's a powerful moment. And that brings us to this really common theme throughout Jewish history, this back and forth between assimilation and persecution.
Yeah, it's a sad but true pattern. Things are good, people blend in, then persecution hits, and boom, identity comes rushing back.
You said it perfectly.
Yeah.
And that reawakening usually leads to people coming together, supporting each other. We see that so beautifully in Purim.
Purim is such a joyful holiday. It's all about resilience, about sticking together against the odds. But even with that happy ending, the Book of Esther still leaves us hanging a bit, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. At the end, Mordecai is still in Persia, still dealing with that tension between fitting in and being Jewish, and we don't really know what happens to Esther in the palace.
It's like a reminder that figuring out your identity, where you belong, it's not a one-and-done thing, it's a constant journey.
And that makes you wonder what happens next, because the story doesn't just stop there. We've got Nehemiah heading back to Jerusalem, and lots of Jews start returning to their homeland.
So the Book of Esther is just one piece of a much bigger story about Jewish identity in exile.
Exactly. Things keep evolving with new challenges and new chances for the Jewish people. But those themes of identity, resilience, community, they stick around.
It's amazing how relevant those themes still are today. What do you think the Book of Esther, especially when we see it through this historical lens, what can it teach us?
especially for Jewish communities living outside Israel, in the diaspora.
Yeah.
How do you hold on to your identity while being part of a different culture?
It's that age-old balancing act. And the Book of Esther shows us that this isn't new. This struggle's been going on for generations.
Right. And that's why it resonates with so many people, even if they're not Jewish. We've all felt that pull to belong, to fit in, while staying true to ourselves.
Absolutely. It's about finding your place in the world without losing who you are. And then there's that amazing message about community, about banding together when things get tough. Purim really embodies that.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even when things are dark, there's always hope, always a reason to celebrate and be resilient.
Well, this deep dive has been so insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. You've given us a lot to ponder.
It was my pleasure. And, the learning never really stops. There's always more to discover, especially if the story is complex as Esther.
So true. And on that note, listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these different interpretations? What parts of the Book of Esther speak to you most? Come, share your ideas with us on social media. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep jiving deep.